Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The news yesterday that Yahoo had, without noticing, been robbed of data on 1 billion users capped a year in which hacking has rarely been out of the news. The idea that the Russians might try to steal emails in order to discredit a candidate in an American presidential election would have seemed preposterous a decade ago. Now, it's what intelligence services think actually happened. It's a development with all sorts of implications, not least the questions it raises for journalists about how they should treat stolen information. Well, Newsnight's editor, Ian Katz, who was involved in covering some of the biggest leaks of recent years, decided to dust off his reporter's notebook.
Our digital world is frighteningly leaky. The unvarnished opinions of Hollywood executives, the medical records of top athletes, the internal debates of a presidential campaign. Scarcely a month goes by without some new cache of sensitive data being thrown into the harsh glare of public scrutiny. And increasingly, it is states who are putting them there.
It's a new kind of information war, one that challenges the very idea of what privacy means in a digital world, and one that poses new and difficult questions for journalists.
The President earlier this week instructed the intelligence community to conduct a full review of the pattern of malicious cyber activity related to our presidential election cycle.
In the United States, an election full of twists has saved one of its most breathtaking till last. A president-elect is locked in a standoff with the CIA over whether Russia mounted a hacking campaign to help put him in the White House.
I think it's ridiculous.
WikiLeaks today just released a brand new batch of hacked emails.
Neera Tanden served as a close aide to Hillary Clinton and was a confidant of Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta, whose hacked emails were leaked daily during the last weeks of the campaign. As the emails were drip-fed by WikiLeaks, Tanden's candid opinions generated a string of awkward headlines.
Clinton confidant Neera Tanden wrote to campaign chair John Podesta, "Do we actually know who told Hillary she could use a private email? And has that person been drawn and quartered?"
I was watching TV, and there was one of my emails on TV, and the next day, a Twitter storm developed because of something I'd said, and it was just like it became a kind of daily humiliation, like just ever-present terrible experience. And it became one where it's like every morning I'd have to brace myself for some new email coming out in which I'd have to, apologize to somebody, or I just mostly deal with, people kind of ruffling through your most private thoughts and sticking them on the internet. And so it was the worst experience I've ever had professionally.
Whatever the precise intention of those behind the hack, Tanden has little doubt about its impact.
I believe the leak was a large part of why Hillary had real problems with millennials, which is why she did not hit her targets in the 3 states Trump won.
Could it have been the difference?
Absolutely. And I think people have to live with that.
There's nothing new, of course, about states hacking the computer systems of other nations for commercial information or security secrets. And there's nothing new about states getting hold of embarrassing information about individuals and releasing it to intimidate them or discredit them. The Russians even have a word for it. They call it kompromat. What the latest attacks have done is bring together these 2 tactics to create a new one. The data leak has been weaponized.
So the from email at first glance looks like Google security. If you go into the text behind the email, you can see it's sent from, in this case, a Yandex email account. Yandex being a Russian free webmail service.
Tony Gidwani is a former Pentagon analyst who spends her time identifying new online threats. The so-called spearfish mail that caught out John Podesta, similar to this one, was an elegantly executed version of a scam all email users are familiar with. but it bore the digital fingerprints of a hacking group linked to Russian intelligence.
There's a brazenness in the attacks that we have seen this year that has been surprising. The Russians don't seem to care that this activity is being attributed to them. And there's also a meanness to it. They're willing to dump a tremendous amount of personal, private information as part of these attacks. And we know it's the Russian government. These attacks have been attributed by the US government, as an assessment that's been shared by a number of companies in the private sector.
So where does this leave reporters and editors who've always had to think carefully about a source's motives? 5 years ago, I was one of the journalists who collaborated with WikiLeaks to publish stories based on thousands of leaked US diplomatic cables. Some criticized the publication of secret documents, but few doubted the motivation of the person who leaked them. Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, was so convinced she had to expose what she considered to be abuse of power that she was prepared to go to jail for it.
But how should news organizations behave when they're effectively handed troves of confidential information by foreign states with transparent motives? Some have argued that we risk becoming useful idiots when we publish precisely the damaging stories that a hostile government wants us to.
What's to become of a cycling superhero?
We wrestled with that question on Newsnight earlier this year, when we ran a series of stories based on the medical files of top athletes. Files we were pretty sure had been hacked by the Russians. It felt uneasy giving Moscow just what it wanted. But the public interest in examining whether one of Britain's sporting heroes had broken the spirit of the rules, if not the rules themselves, was clear. Not all the revelations in these leaks are quite as significant.
Now, thanks to Russian hackers and a little help from chief stirrer Julian Assange, I can now make a pretty passable risotto. As John Podesta explained in one of the leaked emails, it's all about adding the stock slowly. I also know, this time thanks to the North Koreans, that Tom Hanks uses the alias Johnny Madrid when checking into hotels, and that Hollywood producer Scott Rudin thinks that Angelina Jolie is a minimally talented, spoiled brat. The question is, have we journalists become a little too willing to serve up every tasty morsel provided by the hackers?
Perhaps unsurprisingly, some of those who've seen their own private communications sprayed across the internet think so.
On cable news all day, you have a quote from someone about somebody else in the campaign. You know, I mean, it's like under the veneer of journalism, reporters were totally trafficking in gossip. And that's what they were doing.
The New York Times has run a string of stories this year based on the Podesta emails and, before that, material hacked from the Democratic National Committee. I asked the paper's editor if the thought that he might be doing Vladimir Putin's bidding ever keeps him up at night.
Sure it does. Sure it does. But it would keep me up at night worse, or at least longer, if I had information from a hack that I knew was accurate, that voters and citizens needed to know. And I'm not publishing it because maybe it came from the Russians. I can't imagine a slipperier slope than that, right? At what point is my safe at home filled with information I can't report because I'm nervous about the source?
If someone had brought you a carton of papers, actual hard paper papers, and you knew for certain those were burgled from John Podesta's home, would you treat those the same as you treat a cache of emails?
Boy, that's a good and very hard question that I've not had to confront yet. I would go through it. And if it was really significant and important, I would publish it. It would make me nervous. I would admit to people how we got it, but I think the information trumps all.
There's a powerful argument that it doesn't really matter how news organizations like the New York Times and the BBC handle hacked material, because in the wild west of the internet, there'll always be someone willing to publish. Some argue we should just accept there's no such thing as privacy in our digital lives. One high-profile victim of a major hack told me he now communicates about all sensitive matters by fax or phone. Kieran Martin is the man charged with defending Britain against cyber attack. He's about to step out of the shadows of GCHQ to lead the new National Cyber Security Centre. He told me measures were taken to protect the 2015 British election from hackers, but there is a danger that the recent US experience will inspire other attackers.
Well, there are all sorts of threats from state cyber attackers. There are threats to critical national systems. There are threats to our economic well-being through commercial espionage. And yes, if there may well be a perception now that this is a successful model for intervention in societies such as ours and those of our allies, and clearly that's something we'll need to be prepared to deal with.
But he insists we're a long way from having to give up on the idea of privacy in the digital world.
Stealing information for political purposes, for financial purposes, for whatever purposes, is as old as human activity itself. The digital world gives people an opportunity to do that at a different scale, but there's plenty to do to defend ourselves. We need to demystify this. If we wrap the problem in a shroud of mystique and assume that there are these people sitting at computers in faraway places that cannot be contested, that is an incredibly damaging attitude to take.
Perhaps one detail of the US hacking story embodies the very human vulnerability Kieran Martin and his counterparts can do little about. When John Podesta received his fateful Spearfish mail, an aide sent it to his IT department. A staffer replied, saying it was legitimate. That staffer now says it was a typo. He meant to type illegitimate. It's a heart-stopping thought. The course of history changed, perhaps, by 2 missing letters.
Ian Katz there.
I've been